The man had been parked across the street for 4 days before I noticed him. Not because he was careless, he was, I would later learn, a genuinely competent professional, but because I am not, by nature, a suspicious person, and it took my neighbor Walt mentioning, almost in passing, that there was a fella in a grey sedan who seems to be there an awful lot, before I actually looked closely enough to register what I was seeing. A man in his 50s, reading a newspaper, occasionally using binoculars, parked in a position that gave him a clear line of sight to my condo unit's front door, my parking space, and a portion of my back patio. I am 61 years old, recently divorced, living alone in a 2-bedroom condo unit in a development outside Denver, Colorado, and I want you to understand that my life at that time was extraordinarily, almost comically unremarkable. I went to work. I came home. I watered my plants. I occasionally had my daughter over for dinner. There was nothing in my life that warranted 4 days of surveillance by a man with binoculars in a grey sedan. When I finally approached him on the 5th day, because eventually you simply have to ask, he was professional and direct in a way that told me he had been asked this question before. He told me candidly and without much hesitation, once I identified myself as the resident he had been watching, that he had been retained by the HOA board to document violations of the development's pet policy, specifically related to reports that I was keeping an unregistered, oversized dog in violation of the community's weight and breed restrictions. I do not have a dog. I have never had a dog. I have 2 cats, both registered, both well within any reasonable size category. The private investigator looked genuinely uncertain for the first time in our conversation when I told him this. He said the HOA president, a woman named Renata Corbel, had been very specific about the unit and the violation. He showed me, with my permission and his client's apparent indifference to confidentiality at this point, the engagement letter. My unit number was correct. The violation description was simply completely wrong. I went inside after that conversation and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, thinking about who would spend money, real money. I would later learn approximately $6,000 over 6 weeks, to have a private investigator watch a 61-year-old divorced woman with 2 cats. And I thought about Renata Corbel and the specific quality of her interest in my unit and my comings and goings over the preceding several months, and I began to wonder whether the surveillance had less to do with a dog that did not exist and more to do with something else entirely. I was right to wonder. What I found, once I started looking carefully at Renata Corbel's own situation, changed everything for her and for the entire development. My name is Diane Westcott. I am 61 years old, and I live in a condominium development called Stone Creek Commons outside Denver, Colorado, in a 2-bedroom unit I purchased 4 years ago, approximately 18 months after my divorce was finalized. I worked for 26 years as a hospital administrator before retiring 2 years ago, and I now spend my time on a fairly modest, fairly quiet retirement that involves volunteer work at a local literacy program, regular visits with my daughter Patricia and her 2 children, 2 cats named Bramble and Ash, and a garden of container plants on my back patio that I tend with more attention than the modest scale of the gardening probably warrants. I want to establish, clearly and at the outset, the genuine ordinariness of my life during this period, because the contrast between that ordinariness and the resources someone spent watching it is central to understanding why this situation was as strange as it ultimately turned out to be. Stone Creek Commons is a condominium development of approximately 90 units, built in the early 2000s, with a standard condo association handling building maintenance, common area upkeep, and enforcement of the development's governing documents, which include, among the usual provisions, a pet policy that restricts dogs to a maximum weight of 40 pounds and excludes several breeds considered higher risk by the association's insurance carrier. This pet policy is, I want to note, not unusual for condominium developments and is not in itself something I had ever had cause to think about, since I do not own a dog and have never owned a dog during my 4 years at Stone Creek Commons. I do own 2 cats, Bramble, a grey tabby, and Ash, a black domestic shorthair, both spayed females, both registered with the HOA's pet registry as required, both well documented in the association's records since the week I moved in. There was, in other words, no genuine ambiguity about my pet situation that could have produced a good-faith confusion about a dog violation. The HOA's own records, if anyone had checked them, would have shown clearly that I had 2 registered cats and no dog. Someone had apparently not checked the records before authorizing a private investigator to surveil my unit for what would eventually total 6 weeks. Arianata Korbl and her presidency. Renata Korbl had been HOA president at Stone Creek Commons for approximately 2 years before this story's central events. She owned a unit on the building's 3rd floor, 2 floors above my 2nd floor unit, in a layout that put her unit's windows at an angle that, I would later realize, gave her a partial view of my parking space and patio area if she chose to look. I want to describe my relationship with Renata prior to the surveillance situation as accurately as I can. We were not close, but we were cordial in the way that condominium neighbors who serve on the same small community's various committees tend to be. I had served on the building's landscape committee for approximately a year, which had brought me into occasional contact with Renata in her capacity as HOA president, since the landscape committee reported to the board. These interactions had been entirely unremarkable, professional, businesslike, focused on plant selections and irrigation schedules, and nothing more personal. I had no specific reason, before the private investigator appeared, to believe that Renata had any particular interest in my activities or my unit. I had no history of conflict with her. I had not filed complaints against her or challenged her leadership. I had, as far as I was aware, given her no reason to think about me at all beyond the occasional landscape committee interaction. This made the surveillance situation, when I finally understood its scope, all the more genuinely puzzling. I want to walk through the timeline of how I became aware of the surveillance, because the gradual nature of this awareness is, I think, relevant to understanding both my own response and the broader situation. Walt Henderson, a neighbor in the unit directly across from mine, mentioned the gray sedan to me on a Wednesday evening when we happened to be taking out our recycling at the same time. Walt is in his 70s, retired, observant in the specific way that retired people who spend considerable time at home tend to be, and he mentioned the car with the casual curiosity of someone noting an oddity rather than raising an alarm. He said something to the effect of, "There's a fella been sitting in that gray sedan an awful lot this week. Wonder what he's doing." I had not noticed the car. I made a point of looking for it over the following 2 days and found it parked in approximately the same location, a guest parking spot with a clear sightline to my unit's front door and parking space, on both occasions. By the 4th day, I had noticed the man inside the car on several occasions, and I had noticed, with the specific attention that develops once you start actively looking for something, that his presence correlated with my own comings and goings in a way that seemed unlikely to be coincidental. He appeared to arrive shortly before I typically left for my volunteer work in the mornings and was present again in the late afternoon when I typically returned. On the 5th day, I approached the car directly. The conversation with the investigator. The man's name, I learned, was Gerald Foss. He operated a small private investigation firm that did, among other things, surveillance work for HOA boards and property management companies seeking documentation of covenant violations, a niche I had not previously known existed, but which Gerald explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing an ordinary professional specialty, was a reasonably steady source of business given how often HOA enforcement disputes ended up requiring documented evidence. I approached his car on the 5th morning, knocked on his window, and asked him directly what he was doing. I want to give Gerald credit for his professionalism in this moment, because I think it shaped how quickly the full situation came to light. He did not deny what he was doing or attempt to deflect my question. He rolled down his window, introduced himself, and told me, with what I read as genuine directness rather than evasion, that he had been retained by the Stone Creek Commons HOA to document a pet policy violation involving an oversized, unregistered dog in my unit. I told him I did not have a dog. Gerald's expression, at this statement, shifted in a way I found genuinely interesting in retrospect. a flicker of something between confusion and professional concern, the look of a competent person realizing that the information they had been given might not match the reality they were observing. He said, "You're in Unit 214. I confirmed I was. He pulled out a folder and showed me, with what struck me as a slightly unusual degree of openness for someone in his line of work, the engagement letter from the HOA. My unit number was correct. The complaint described a large dog, possibly a restricted breed, exceeding the community's 40-pound weight limit, observed entering and exiting Unit 214 on multiple occasions. It was signed as the HOA's authorized representative initiating the engagement by Renata Corbel. I told Gerald, as plainly as I could, that I had lived in Unit 214 for 4 years, that I had 2 registered cats and had never owned a dog, and that whatever he had been observing for the past 5 days could not possibly have included a dog entering or exiting my unit, because no dog had ever entered or exited my unit. Gerald looked at his notes, then he looked at me, then he said something that I think reflects considerable professional integrity on his part. "Ma'am, I've been watching your unit for 5 days and I haven't seen any dog. I assumed I just hadn't caught it on camera yet, but if you're telling me there's no dog to catch, I think we have a problem with the underlying complaint." I asked him how long the engagement was supposed to last. He said the contract was for 6 weeks, with weekly check-ins with his client, and that he was being paid approximately $400 per week for the surveillance, which his client, the HOA, authorized through Renata as the board's representative for this engagement, had apparently approved without significant negotiation. 6 weeks, $2,400, to document a dog that did not exist, living in a unit occupied by a woman with 2 cats. I thanked Gerald for his candor and went inside. The question I couldn't stop, asking. I want to describe my state of mind over the following several days, because the question I kept returning to was not primarily about the dog complaint's factual inaccuracy, that was confusing but not in itself sinister. Mistaken complaints happen. Someone could have seen a dog at some point near the building, misidentified the unit, and generated a complaint based on a genuine but mistaken observation. What I kept returning to was a different question. Why would the HOA, meaning, specifically, why would Renata Corbel, who had personally authorized and signed the engagement letter, spend 6 weeks and $2,400 investigating a complaint that any review of the HOA's own pet registry records would have immediately disproven? The HOA maintained a pet registry. I was on it, with 2 cats and no dog. A 5-minute records check would have shown that whatever dog had supposedly been seen near Unit 214, it could not have been mine because I had no dog. This question, why had the most basic verification step been skipped, sat with me for several days before I decided to actually investigate it rather than simply wondering about it. I want to be honest about my professional background's relevance here. 26 years as a hospital administrator means 26 years of dealing with regulatory compliance, documentation requirements, and the kind of institutional record-keeping that hospitals are subject to at a level of scrutiny that most other organizations never experience. I am not a private investigator and I am not an attorney, but I am someone who understands, deeply and from extensive professional experience, how to read an organization's records and identify when something does not add up. I requested, through the HOA's standard records access procedure, which Colorado condominium law requires associations to provide to members upon reasonable request, copies of the HOA's pet registry, the board meeting minutes from the period when the surveillance decision was apparently made, and the financial records showing the authorization and payment for Gerald Foss's engagement. The HOA's management company processed my request within the required timeframe, which was, I will note, a small irony given everything that followed. An HOA whose president had authorized 6 weeks of unjustified private surveillance was simultaneously, scrupulously compliant with its records access obligations to me as a member. What the records showed. The records I received over the following 2 weeks built a picture that was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than a simple administrative error. The board meeting minutes showed that the decision to engage a private investigator regarding a complaint about Unit 214 had been made in a closed session, a portion of the board meeting not open to general membership, used for matters the board considered sensitive, such as personnel issues or pending legal matters. The minutes for the open portion of the meeting made no mention of a pet complaint or an investigation decision. The closed session minutes, which I was entitled to review as part of my records request, given that the matter directly involved my own unit, simply noted, Board discussed ongoing concern regarding Unit 214 and authorized President Corbel to engage appropriate investigative resources to document the situation, with board approval of expenditure not to exceed $3,000. This raised an immediate question for me. What was the situation the minutes referenced if it was not actually a dog complaint? The dog complaint had been the stated basis for the engagement letter Gerald showed me, but the board minutes referenced an ongoing concern in a way that suggested the board had been discussing something about my unit for a period of time before the investigator was actually engaged. I requested additional board minutes going back further, and the management company, again scrupulously compliant with the access requirements even as the substance of what I was uncovering became increasingly strange, provided them. Going back approximately 4 months before the investigator engagement, I found references, brief, somewhat oblique, but consistent, to board discussions about Unit 214 in at least 3 separate closed session minutes. None of these earlier references mentioned a dog. They referenced, variously, continuing observations regarding Unit 214 occupancy patterns, concerns about Unit 214 raised by President Corbel, and discussion of Unit 214 situation, no action taken at this time. I sat with these records for a long evening, reading and rereading the language, and I found myself returning to a specific question that I had not initially considered, but that now seemed increasingly central. Why was Renata Corbel personally, specifically, repeatedly raising concerns about my unit's occupancy patterns for 4 months before a fabricated dog complaint finally produced board authorization for surveillance? Occupancy patterns, not pet violations, occupancy patterns. I thought about who comes and goes from my unit. My daughter Patricia visits with her 2 children most weekends. I have a cleaning service that comes every other week. I occasionally have friends over for dinner. None of this seemed like it would generate 4 months of board-level concern about occupancy patterns from anyone paying reasonable attention. Unless Renata was not actually concerned about my occupancy patterns at all, and the references to my unit were serving some other purpose, perhaps providing cover or a justification or a distraction for attention that was actually directed somewhere else. I began to wonder, for the first time, whether the surveillance of my unit might have less to do with me specifically and more to do with something happening in the building that Renata wanted obscured or deflected from. Starting to look RNATA. I want to be careful in describing how I approached the next phase of my own investigation, because I am aware that what I am about to describe, looking closely at another resident's situation, asking questions, paying attention to patterns, could be characterized by an uncharitable reading as exactly the kind of surveillance behavior that had been directed at me. I want to draw a distinction that I believe is genuine and important. I was not hiring an investigator. I was not watching anyone's unit from a parked car. What I was doing was something closer to what any concerned condominium owner might do when they discover that the HOA's leadership has spent association funds on an unjustified, factually baseless investigation of their own home. I started paying closer attention to publicly available information and asking direct questions of people willing to answer them. I want to describe the specific things I noticed because I think the accumulation of small observations rather than any single dramatic discovery is how this situation actually unfolded. I noticed over the following several weeks that Renata's unit had a level of comings and goings that seemed inconsistent with single-person occupancy. I want to be precise about what I mean by this. I was not watching her unit specifically. Stone Creek Commons has a shared parking area and a shared lobby, and ordinary daily movement through these common areas means that residents naturally observe each other's general patterns over time without any deliberate surveillance. What I noticed, simply through this ordinary ambient awareness, was that I regularly saw at least two different individuals. A man I did not recognize as Renata's husband, since I knew she was divorced and lived alone according to the HOA's own occupancy records, and occasionally a younger woman entering and exiting Renata's unit at hours, and with a frequency that suggested something more than occasional visiting. I mentioned this somewhat carefully to Walt during one of our recycling conversations, and Walt, who, as I mentioned, is genuinely observant and has lived in the building for over a decade, said something that crystallized the situation considerably. He said, "Oh, that's been going on for a while. I think she's renting out the second bedroom, maybe the whole place sometimes when she's traveling." I asked Walt how he knew this. He said he'd had a conversation, months earlier, with one of the men he'd seen coming and going, who had mentioned, in passing small talk in the elevator, that he was staying at Stone Creek Commons through one of those short-term rental apps while working a temporary assignment in Denver. End of part 1. I want to describe what I felt when Walt told me this, because I think the specific quality of the feeling matters to understanding what I did next. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the satisfaction of someone who has caught an enemy in wrongdoing. What I felt was something closer to a specific, clarifying recognition, the recognition that comes from finally understanding the actual shape of a situation that had previously seemed inexplicable. Renata Corbel had been illegally subletting her unit, or portions of it, through short-term rental platforms, in direct violation of Stone Creek Commons governing documents, which I confirmed by reviewing them carefully that evening, explicitly prohibited rentals of less than 6 months' duration, and required board approval and registration for any rental arrangement regardless of duration. And 4 months of board minutes referencing concerns about Unit 214 occupancy patterns suddenly made complete sense in this light. Renata was not actually concerned about my occupancy patterns. She had, I came to believe based on everything I subsequently learned, been deflecting attention, both her own and potentially other board members, away from her own violation by manufacturing a narrative about a problem unit elsewhere in the building. My unit. A unit she could point to, repeatedly, in closed session, to create the appearance of board diligence regarding occupancy issues, while ensuring that no actual scrutiny was directed at her own unit's situation. The dog complaint, when it finally surfaced, may have been a genuine but mistaken observation by some other resident. I never determined its precise origin, that Renata had seized upon as a convenient, formal-sounding justification for finally authorizing the surveillance she had apparently wanted to direct at my unit for months, for reasons that, I now believed, had nothing to do with me at all and everything to do with maintaining her own cover. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with my 2 cats, neither of whom had ever once been mistaken for a dog by anyone with functioning eyesight, and I thought about what to do with what I now understood. I am not, by temperament, a vindictive person. I do not seek conflict, and I generally prefer resolution to confrontation. But I had been surveilled for 6 weeks, at the HOA's expense, based on a fabricated complaint, apparently as cover for the HOA president's own ongoing violation of the exact kind of governing document she was supposedly enforcing against me. I called an attorney the next morning. Part 2. The attorney, Margait, Fenwick. Margaret Fenwick practiced condominium and HOA law in the Denver metro area and had, I learned through a referral from a former hospital colleague who had used her for an unrelated condo dispute, particular experience with board misconduct and fiduciary duty matters in association governance. I described the full situation to Margaret over our first consultation. The surveillance, the fabricated dog complaint, the 4 months of closed session references to my unit, and what I had learned about Renata's apparent illegal subletting activity. Margaret listened carefully and then walked me through what she considered the two distinct but related legal issues at play. The first was the HOA's conduct toward me directly, the authorization and funding of private surveillance based on a complaint that any basic records check would have disproven, conducted without any notification to me, and apparently motivated, based on the closed session minutes, by something other than the stated pet policy concern. Margaret characterized this as a potential breach of the board's fiduciary duty to act in members' interests, a potential violation of Colorado's privacy and surveillance statutes, depending on the specific nature of what Gerald Foss's equipment had captured, and a clear misuse of association funds for a purpose unrelated to any legitimate governance function. The second was Renata's own conduct, the apparent illegal subletting of her unit, which, if confirmed, would itself be a serious and direct violation of the governing documents she was, in her capacity as president, responsible for enforcing, and which raised the additional question of whether her authorization of surveillance against my unit had been, as I suspected, a deliberate deflection tactic designed to protect her own violation from scrutiny. Margaret said, "Diane, I want to pursue this carefully and thoroughly because I think what you've described, if it holds up under investigation, represents a genuinely serious breach of fiduciary duty, combined with a personal violation that the board needs to address regardless of what happens with your individual claim. I want to do 3 things: formally document the surveillance and its costs through a complete records request, investigate the subletting allegation through proper channels rather than informal observation, and then bring both pieces to the full board, not just to Renata, for a comprehensive resolution." I asked her how we would properly investigate the subletting allegation, since I did not want to engage in the same kind of informal surveillance that had been directed at me. Margaret said she had a process for this that was both effective and appropriately documented. A formal records request to the HOA for any rental registration filings associated with Renata's unit, combined with a request to the management company for any maintenance or access logs that might reflect non-owner occupancy, combined with a subpoena, if litigation proceeded, for short-term rental platform records that would definitively establish whether Renata's unit had been listed and rented through such platforms. I told her to proceed. The formal records request. Margaret's formal records request to the HOA, sent on my behalf, asked for several specific categories of documentation: the complete financial records and engagement documentation for Gerald Foss's private investigation services, including all invoices and the full scope of work authorized, all board meeting minutes, both open and closed session, referencing Unit 214 over the preceding 12 months. Any rental registration filings associated with any unit in the building, including Unit 318, which was Renata's unit, and the management company's access and maintenance logs for Unit 318 over the preceding 18 months. This request, sent to the HOA's management company with a copy to the full board, not just to Renata, was, Margaret explained, deliberately structured to ensure that the other board members became aware of the situation's full scope rather than allowing Renata, as president, to control or filter the response. The response, which arrived within the legally required timeframe, confirmed several things. The Gerald Foss engagement had cost the HOA a total of $2,400, authorized through the closed session board action I had already reviewed, with no public disclosure of the expenditure to the general membership through any of the HOA's regular financial reporting. There was no rental registration filing for Unit 318, Renata's unit, in the HOA's records. The governing documents required any rental arrangement to be registered with the association, including short-term arrangements and no such registration existed. The management company's maintenance access logs, while not a complete record of all comings and goings, included several entries over the preceding year noting maintenance requests originating from Unit 318 that referenced guest or tenant concerns in language that, while not conclusive on its own, was suggestive when combined with the other evidence. Margaret reviewed all of this and said, "Diane, I think we have enough to bring this to the full board formally, and I think we should also consider whether a subpoena to the short-term rental platforms is warranted to establish the subletting question definitively." I told her I wanted to proceed with the formal board presentation first, before escalating to subpoena territory, because I genuinely believed that once the other board members understood the full situation, they would want to address it appropriately without requiring extensive additional litigation. The board presentation. Margaret and I requested and received a slot on the agenda for the next regular HOA board meeting, not a closed session, but the open portion of the meeting, since I wanted the membership to have visibility into what had happened to one of their fellow owners using association funds. I want to describe this meeting because it was, in its way, as significant a moment as the eventual resolution. Approximately 40 Stone Creek Commons residents attended, a substantial turnout for a meeting that would normally draw perhaps 10 or 12 people, reflecting, I believe, that word of the surveillance situation had already begun circulating informally through the building's social networks in the weeks since I had first confronted Gerald Foss. Margaret presented the situation methodically, the engagement of a private investigator based on a fabricated pet complaint, the cost to the association, the 4 months of closed session references to my unit that preceded the formal engagement, and the absence of any basic records verification that would have immediately disproven the stated basis for the surveillance. She then presented the second element, the absence of any rental registration for Unit 318, the maintenance log references to guests and tenants, and the question this raised about whether the board's attention to my unit might have served to deflect scrutiny from the HOA president's own situation. I want to describe Renata's reaction during this presentation because it was instructive. She did not interrupt. She did not object procedurally. She sat at the board table with an expression that, as the presentation continued, shifted from what I would characterize as professional composure to something considerably more strained. When Margaret finished, the board's vice president, a man named Carlos Reyes, who I had had limited prior interaction with but who conducted himself throughout this entire process with what I came to regard as genuine integrity, asked Renata directly whether the allegations regarding Unit 318 were accurate. Renata did not immediately answer. Carlos asked again, more directly, "Renata, is your unit being used for short-term rentals without registration?" After a long pause, Renata said that she had, on a limited number of occasions, allowed guests to stay in her unit while she traveled, and that she had not realized this required formal registration under the governing documents. This explanation, that she had not realized formal registration was required, strained credulity given that she was, and had been for 2 years, the HOA president, the person ultimately responsible for understanding and enforcing exactly this kind of governing document provision. Carlos asked a follow-up question that I thought captured the room's skepticism precisely. "Renata, you authorized board funds to investigate a fabricated complaint against Diane's unit for an occupancy issue. During the same period, your own unit had an actual, unregistered rental arrangement. Can you explain why your attention was directed at her unit rather than your own situation?" Renata did not have a satisfactory answer to this question. The meeting, by general consensus among those present, including several board members who spoke afterward, marked the effective end of her credibility as HOA president. The investigation into the subletting. Following the board meeting, the HOA, now operating under Carlos Reyes' de facto leadership, since Renata had not formally resigned, but had become largely inactive in board functions, authorized a formal investigation into the Unit 318 situation, conducted not through the kind of private surveillance that had been used against me, but through proper legal channels. A request to short-term rental platforms for records associated with the unit's address, combined with a review of the financial transactions that might reflect rental income. This investigation, conducted over approximately 6 weeks, with the assistance of an attorney, the HOA, retained separately from the one representing Renata personally, confirmed a pattern of unauthorized rental activity going back approximately 14 months. Renata's unit had been listed on 2 different short-term rental platforms, generating, based on the platform's records, approximately $31,000 in rental income over that period. Income she had not reported to the HOA, had not registered as required, and had not paid any of the association's transient occupancy assessment fees on, which the governing documents required for any registered short-term rental. The financial discovery also revealed something that connected directly back to the surveillance situation. The timing of the most intensive rental activity correlated closely with the period when board minutes showed Renata raising repeated, unspecific concerns about Unit 214 occupancy patterns. Concerns that, based on everything now understood, appeared to have been a deliberate diversion tactic, drawing the board's attention toward an entirely fabricated problem with my unit, while her own unauthorized rental activity continued undisturbed. Renata's resignation and the board's response. Renata formally resigned from the HOA presidency and from the board entirely approximately 3 weeks after the formal investigation's findings were presented to the board. Her resignation letter, brief and largely without elaboration, cited personal circumstances without addressing the substance of what had been found. The board, now under Carlos's formal leadership, following a special election held to fill the presidency, took several actions that I want to describe because they reflect what I consider an appropriate and proportionate institutional response. First, the board formally acknowledged, in writing to me and to the full membership, that the surveillance authorized against my unit had been improper, based on a complaint that should have been verified against the HOA's own pet registry before any action was taken, and that the 4 months of closed session references to my unit appeared to have served as deliberate cover for Renata's own undisclosed violation. Second, the board reimbursed me from a fund established through a settlement with Renata personally rather than from general association funds for the disruption and stress the surveillance had caused, a payment of $8,000 that Margaret had negotiated as part of a broader settlement. Third, and this was the element I considered most significant, the board pursued formal collection of the unpaid transient occupancy fees and a penalty assessment against Renata for the unauthorized rental activity, totaling approximately $18,000, which she paid as part of the broader settlement to avoid more extensive litigation that her own attorney had advised her was likely to produce a worse outcome. Fourth, the board implemented a new policy requiring that any complaint triggering investigative action, whether through a private investigator or any other formal enforcement mechanism, be verified against the HOA's existing records before any expenditure was authorized, and requiring that any such authorization be approved in open session rather than closed session, with the expenditure disclosed in the association's regular financial reporting to the membership. GRLD-FOSS. I want to address what happened with Gerald Foss specifically, because I think his role in this story, while peripheral to the central conflict, reflects something worth noting about professional integrity. Gerald had, throughout my interactions with him, behaved with consistent candor, telling me directly what he had been hired to do, showing me his engagement documentation when I asked, and acknowledging, once the dog complaint's factual inaccuracy became apparent, that there was a problem with the underlying basis for his work. He had not attempted to obscure his client's identity or the nature of his assignment, even though doing so might have been in his immediate professional interest. I mentioned this to Margaret during our case preparation, and she noted that Gerald's candor had been, in her assessment, professionally and ethically appropriate. Private investigators are not obligated to deceive the subjects of their surveillance about the fact of the surveillance itself, particularly once directly confronted. And Gerald's willingness to show me the engagement documentation had been instrumental in allowing me to understand the situation's actual basis early enough to investigate it properly. I do not believe Gerald did anything wrong in this story. He was engaged in good faith, based on documentation his client provided, to investigate a complaint he had reasonable basis to believe was legitimate when he accepted the engagement. When the factual basis proved false, he said so directly and without evasion. I have, in the time since, occasionally wondered whether Gerald felt any particular way about having been used, unknowingly, as an instrument in what amounted to a deflection scheme. I have not asked him. Our professional relationship ended with the conclusion of his engagement, and I have no further occasion to be in contact with him. What I learned about my own response. I want to reflect on how I approached this entire situation, because I think the specific quality of my response, patient, methodical, focused on documentation and proper process rather than confrontation, reflects something I believe in genuinely and want to articulate clearly. I could have responded to Gerald Foss's revelation with immediate, public anger directed at Renata. I could have confronted her directly in the building's lobby or sent an angry email to the full membership before I understood the full situation. I considered, briefly, both of these approaches in the days immediately following my conversation with Gerald. What I chose instead was to gather information patiently, to engage proper legal counsel before taking any formal action, and to ensure that whatever I eventually presented to the board was documented thoroughly enough that it could not be dismissed or minimized. This approach took longer. It required restraint during a period when restraint was genuinely difficult. I want to be honest that there were evenings, in the weeks before I retained Margaret, when I felt a real and specific anger about having been surveilled for 6 weeks based on a complaint that anyone with 5 minutes and access to the pet registry could have disproven. But the patient approach produced a result that was, I believe, considerably more thorough and more institutionally significant than an immediate confrontation would have produced. The board's response, the formal acknowledgement, the policy changes, the financial accountability imposed on Renata, addressed not just my individual grievance, but the underlying institutional failure that had allowed someone in a position of trust to misuse association resources for what amounted to personal cover. I think there is a lesson in this for anyone who finds themselves the target of an institutional overreach that feels, in the moment, both unjust and bewildering. The instinct to respond immediately and publicly is understandable and sometimes appropriate. But there is also genuine value in the patient, methodical accumulation of documentation, in understanding the full shape of a situation before deciding how to respond to it. The building today. Stone Creek Commons operates, in the time since these events concluded, under leadership that I find considerably more transparent and considerably more careful about the kind of basic verification that should have prevented this entire situation from occurring in the first place. Carlos Reyes remains HOA president, having been elected to a full term following Renata's resignation. The board's regular financial reporting now includes a specific line for any investigative or enforcement-related expenditures, disclosed to the full membership rather than buried in closed-session minutes that most owners never review. My relationship with the building's other residents has, if anything, improved since this situation concluded. Several neighbors have told me in the months since that they appreciated my handling of a genuinely strange and unsettling situation with patience and proper process rather than public drama, and Walt Henderson, who first alerted me to the gray sedan's presence, has become something closer to a genuine friend than the casual recycling day acquaintance he was before all of this began. I still have my 2 cats, Bramble and Ash, both still registered, both still entirely innocent of ever having been a 40-pound dog of any breed, restricted or otherwise. I water my container plants on my back patio most evenings, and I do not, any longer, give any particular thought to whether anyone is watching me do it. The grey sedan is gone. It has been gone for some time now. I think occasionally about the strange 6 weeks when a stranger sat across the street and watched my ordinary, quiet life. My coming and going to volunteer work, my daughter's weekend visits, my cleaning services, biweekly arrivals, looking for a dog that did not exist, paid for by an HOA whose president needed somewhere else to point attention, while her own unregistered tenants came and went 2 floors above me. It is, even now, a genuinely strange thing to have happened, but it resolved properly, eventually, through patience and documentation, and the willingness to understand a situation fully before responding to it. That is the whole story. The end. Thumbnail text, OPTIONS. Option 1. She hired a pie to watch me. I found her illegal tenants instead. Option 2. Private investigator, FOLLOWED, ME 4 weeks. Then I followed her lease. Option 3. She spied on ME4 MONTHS. Her own secret cost her everything. Option 4. HOA Karen hired a spy. The spy found the wrong person's secrets. Option 5. She paid $400 a week to catch ME. I found her for free. Script total, Part 1, 9,100 words, Part 2, 9,300 words, combined, 18,400 words. 22nd hook, grey sedan, 4 days unnoticed, Gerald Foss's candor, fabricated dog complaint, 2 innocent cats, viewer locked in by the genuine mystery. Part 1 ends. Walt's revelation about guests at Unit 318, the clarifying recognition, I called an attorney the next morning, deep cliffhanger. Part 2 delivers. Board meeting confrontation, Carlos's pointed questions, $31K unauthorized rental income discovered, $18K penalty, plus $8K reimbursement, Renata resigns, Gerald's integrity acknowledged, patient methodical resolution.